Good morning and welcome to my neighborhood. Today we're talking about scheduling social events after vaccines. Randall Munroe has been doing a comic. He specializes in comics that deal with romance, sarcasm, math, and language. That is, he gets you to think a little bit. In this case, he's looking at the tough problem of figuring out who you can get together with after you've been vaccinated. Not just the first vaccine, but he carefully notes the first and the second vaccine with appropriate amounts of time after each one to develop antibodies and hopefully T cells. It's an interesting scheduling problem. He makes a comment that it's NP hard, that's non-deterministically polynomial time hard, which is kind of hard to understand. So sometimes it's easier to think about NP complete, which means that a problem can't be solved in a finite amount of time. NP hard is kind of getting there, but not quite there. So scheduling is always a bugaboo. You can approximate scheduling quite easily. So math out of the way, we can focus on the romance, language, and sarcasm involved here. Possibly a little bit of biology. So, the comic is a chart. On the left-hand side are the characters in the comic. And as you go from left to right, it's a timeline. So when you follow along the line for any specific character going left to right, it shows when they got their first vaccination, a dotted line to allow time for development of antibodies and hopefully T cells, and then a second vaccination, and a dotted line to allow for further development. So once we get somebody immunized, theoretically, that is, they've had 2 shots, they've allowed the antibodies and T cells to develop, they get together. It's wonderful. First, they get a couple of people over for dinner, the ones that got their vaccines early, and then a different couple for a movie. Not sure if that was at a theater or at home. And then so on and so forth until they get down to where they can have a larger group going to the cabin after everybody's had 2 vaccines and time for antibodies and T cells and stuff to develop. But as I said, XKCD is really good to get you thinking about these things. So not everybody gets 2 shots. They might get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which only requires 1. Although that's a little up in the air right now due to some very rare blood clotting issues. Very rare. And the other thing is that we have variants of concern. Actually, the variants are interesting because one of the very first variants that nobody talks much about anymore, it got nicknamed Doug. And the viral variants that don't have Doug are known as Douglas. And this strikes me as interesting because it sounds like Randall Munroe has got out into the vaccine naming game. It sounds a little unreal, but I like the Doug and Douglas. Those are the first variants, some of the very first ones that we saw. But now we have the ones that people know about, the B117, which is the Cantor UK variant, which may or may not have the EEK mutation, that is the E484K mutation. Lovely naming, EEK. The P1, P2, and so on from Brazil, or first identified in Brazil, now sweeping through Brazil, does have the EEK mutation, as does the South African variant. There's 2 California variants, there's 2 New York variants, there's a Filipino variant, there is the new Indian double variant that is from India. The question becomes, relative to this comic, is it reasonable, just on a mathematical basis, to assume that once you have these vaccines, it's safe to gather socially? These vaccines were originally tested specifically to stop death and severe illness. Ideally, they would stop transmission as well. But that wasn't the point. They were being developed very quickly. And the point was to stop death and illness and hopefully stop transmission. As we get more optimized binding sites on some of the mutations, like the spike, they call it, the spikes. The DUG mutation made the spikes work better. That's why it took off. The other mutations typically improve on that. The spikes are quite a fragile component of the viral particles, but the mutations, not all of them, of course, just the mutations of concern, we'll call them, the variants of concern, I think is the proper term, tend to cause the spikes to be much more robust, less fragile, and generate more virus, at least in terms of the virus you expel when you breathe, talk, sing, sneeze, all those things. So it becomes more transmissible. Some of them 70% more transmissible. And they require more antibodies to at least in the lab, to contain. Different people make different amounts of antibodies relative to the vaccine, and normally it's adequate, but we don't really know enough about this yet. We don't know how long the antibodies last. People are saying 3 months, 6 months in the more recent studies. We're hoping a lot longer by increasing the period between the first and second vaccine in British Columbia. It's 4 months, 16 weeks. We know from previous types of vaccines, not for this particular pandemic, that quite often a longer time between improves the durability of the immunity. So if you took the XKCD comic and put it into British Columbia, you get your first dose, wait 4 months before you get your second dose, and then wait, we're not sure how long, before you go out and have dinner. So it's a much longer timeline than, 3 weeks or 4 weeks that was initially proposed by the manufacturers. And the reason they proposed this is that they didn't really have time to do testing where they did a 4-month interval duration. What they were trying to do was do a duration that was long enough that the second dose was seen as a distinct dosage and generated a higher level of response from the immunity defined in the first dose, rather than just being seen as a continuation of the first dose. So we've got a long timeline here. But even then, the vaccines may reduce transmissibility. We don't know enough about this yet. But you can still get infected after you have the vaccines, after you've developed some immunity. You probably won't die, and you probably won't get seriously ill. But you may get the virus or one of the variants, and some of the variants may infect you and cause some illness in spite of the vaccine. We don't know much about that yet either. But you may get the virus, be asymptomatic, and be able to pass it on to other people. So this raises the issue of how these variants happen in the first place. They talk about escape variants. And we're seeing the same variants pop up in multiple places. It's not just they start in one place and they travel. That may be happening. But it seems like if you put an organism, like a virus, under pressure, then even on very simple terms, the ones that survive are the ones that survive and propagate and transmit. So if you develop natural immunity because you got sick, or if you have a vaccine that develops an artificial immunity, which is much safer because you're just reacting to a portion of the virus and not getting sick in the process, then when you're exposed to the virus, hopefully it takes it out. But there are ongoing mutations. They're not mutating very quickly. But there's a whole bunch of mutations that happens. You may still contract the virus. And to the degree that we start getting back together, we create a larger population to swap the virus back and forth with. And in some cases, they're saying, oh, well, it replicates in your nose and upper respiratory tract. Doesn't make you really sick, but you can pass it on to somebody else. Don't know about that one. The other kind of thing is, if there is a variant or a mutation within you and you're asymptomatic and all good and everything, but there's enough to pass on, the only thing that survived there may be an escape mutation. That is something, the only thing that was left that could replicate and not be discovered by your current antibodies. So, wisdom of the comic. Everybody talks about like dangling a carrot in front of a horse, on a long stick to make it go. Light at the end of the tunnel and going back to normal. I'm wondering if there's a normal to go back to at this point. We'll see. But we know a little more about the dynamics of how viruses change, just like we do. Humans have adapted to living in the Himalayas and high altitudes, and we've biologically adapted to those things so that we can function in less oxygen. Everything adapts, viruses included. Us too. So, where do we go? This is a great comic. It opens up this whole level of discussion of what do you do? Certainly once you've just had the vaccine, once you've just had the vaccine, is not the time to go out and socialize. And The comic makes this abundantly clear, which is wonderful. But even once we've had the appropriate times for the first and second vaccines, does that mean that we can go back to normal levels of contacts? In British Columbia right now, we have about 60% of normal contacts, and our caseloads have been going up. They might have stabilized at around 1,000 a day, but that's still a little bit unclear. 70% of the cases in the Vancouver area are the P1 variant, which is much more transmissible. 60% of the cases in the Surrey area are the B117, also more transmittable. We're running a little low on vaccines right now. Hopefully, we're told there's more coming in pretty fast, and it looks like they've put as much vaccines into the Vancouver area as they possibly can. So we don't have any here. Or we have the AstraZeneca here, but we don't have the Pfizer and Moderna at this point to any great extent. As a matter of fact, there's no clinics scheduled, or very few of them. Hopefully, that will change sometime soon. When can you safely get back together? We don't know, is the answer. We really don't know. Because if people, after the vaccine, start getting back together and they don't follow this comic and don't pay attention to the other people that they're with and when they were vaccinated and how long it's been since, and when they got their second vaccination and how long it's been since, even then, these are excellent vaccines. I mean, they take you to 97% relative immunity, but there is still that little bit where you can still get sick. You may have been exposed before you got the vaccine, in which case you get the vaccine and you may still get the virus because it takes a while to build up those antibodies. Even if everything goes perfectly, we have these variants of concern. Some of them may not be addressed as well by the vaccines. Some of them may require a really good response in terms of the number of antibodies that are created and T cells that are created. T cells tend to last a lot longer in your body. They're kind of the memory, well, they're part of the memory of your immune system. And they come up when they see this stuff again. This vaccine does some pretty weird things to your immune system. So if we open up, if we go, well, we're all vaccinated, let's get together, let's have a party, let's do a protest, let's go and put everybody together in a house or even outside right now. Transmissibility is really high. Do we then cultivate more interesting variants of concerns? So that's my basic question, is even if we follow this comic to its full extent, will we then still cultivate more variants of concern? Because the vaccines were defined to stop death and serious illness, and to a wishful and greatest extent, we really want them to stop transmission. But do they? We don't know yet. The variants of concern throw a wrench in the works for the people that are vaccinated, for people that have had the virus. So there's a lot we don't know. I assume, as we go forward, we'll see more comics in this regard. So, thank you, Randall. I really appreciate the comics that you do. Really like the thought that goes into them. And for those that are building the explainers, thank you. Some people don't get all the nuance of what goes on in those things. They're quite wonderful. I see you out there. I'm very grateful that you're here. I'm very grateful for all the people that have done amazing things to make these vaccines happen. I mean, this is unheard of. All these new things that have been developed over the last 50 years, but adapted and put into production very quickly. I know that Moderna in January, by the end of January, had a new version that would deal with some of these variants. It's up for review. They had it in initial production by the end of January. It'll take a while to be approved. Haven't heard back on that one. It's warm here today. It's sunny. I hope you have a marvelous day. I hope it's nice where you are. And look up at night. We might have some auroras in the next couple of days. Interesting amount of material hitting us from solar flares. Well, from the sun anyways. There's my friend the raven up there. Talk to you later. If you want to be notified when the next one comes up, click on the bell, click like, subscribe if you want to find us easily. Have a really good day.